The body is a machine. That was the first rule, the foundation of the fortress I had built around myself. It was a simple, elegant principle that had served me well through 3 tours and a subsequent career, patching up the fragile bodies of men who thought they were indestructible. A machine has inputs and outputs, tolerances and breaking points. It can be analyzed, diagnosed, and, with the right application of pressure and stress, repaired. There is no room for emotion in engineering. Emotion is a ghost variable, a corrupting influence that turns clean data into chaos. I dealt in data. I dealt in control. My new assignment was Theodore Thorne. The name was a brand, synonymous with impossible structures that defied gravity and redefined skylines. He was an architect, a visionary, a man who bent steel and glass to his will. 6 months ago, a scaffolding collapse on a site in Dubai had attempted to bend him in return. It had not entirely succeeded, but it had left its mark. The machine was damaged. Comminuted fracture of the left femur, 3 herniated discs, a constellation of nerve damage that lit up his nervous system with a constant, simmering fire. The contract was explicit. 6 weeks. Total isolation. Theodore's private retreat, a glass and cedar monument to his own genius, nestled in a remote mountain valley. My job was to be his physical therapist, his trainer, his shadow. My job was to take the broken parts and force them back into alignment. The isolation was framed as a necessity for focus, a way to eliminate the distractions of his high-profile life. For me, it was ideal. Isolation was my natural habitat. Distractions were my enemy. The house was exactly what I expected. A testament to brutalist minimalism. All sharp lines and vast panes of glass that erased the boundary between inside and out. It was a beautiful cage. When he greeted me at the door, leaning heavily on a sleek carbon fiber cane, he was also what I expected. Taller than his press photo suggested, with a frame that was lean but solid beneath a soft gray cashmere sweater. His hair was a chaotic mess of dark curls, and his eyes were a startlingly clear shade of blue, currently crinkled in a performance of easy charm. "Elijah, welcome to the middle of nowhere." His voice was smooth, cultured, but I registered the micro-tension in his jaw, the subtle shifting of his weight off his injured leg. Pain. A constant grinding input. "Mr. Thorne." I kept my own voice flat, a tool. I did not offer a hand. My hands were for assessment, for manipulation, not for social pleasantries. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Please, it's Theodore. We're going to be living in each other's pockets for the next month and a half. Formalities seem a bit absurd, don't you think?" I didn't answer. Absurdity was another variable I didn't account for. I did my initial assessment in the home's integrated gym, a space that looked more like a design museum than a place for recovery. The air was cool and smelled faintly of ozone from the air filtration system and the clean, woody scent that seemed to be a part of him, sandalwood or cedar. My hands were clinical as I tested his range of motion, palpated the tight, scarred tissue around his hip. He was stoic, his breathing controlled, but I felt the fine tremors that ran through him, the body's silent scream. I noted the way his muscles seized, the sharp, involuntary intake of breath when I found a particularly sensitive trigger point. Data. All of it was just data. The fortress was secure. The rules were in place. I was the engineer. He was the machine. And for the first few days, the system worked. We fell into a rigid routine dictated by my schedule. 0600, mobility and stretching. 0800, breakfast, a precisely calibrated menu I had designed. 1000, strength training. 1200, lunch. The afternoons were his. a time for him to work on his designs on a massive tablet, his brow furrowed in concentration. Then hydrotherapy in the heated indoor pool, dinner, and a final session of massage and nerve gliding exercises before bed. We rarely spoke of anything beyond the immediate task. Flex the quadriceps. Hold for 10. Breathe through the pressure. My words were commands, his were clipped responses. He was a compliant patient, pushing himself to the edge of his tolerance, his jaw set. I admired his discipline, the same way I would admire a well-machined gear. But sometimes, I would watch him when he didn't know I was looking. I'd see him staring out at the vast, indifferent expanse of snow-covered peaks, the perfect geometry of his house reflected in the glass, and his mask of cool determination would slip. The architect would vanish, and in his place would be a man trapped, his expression clouded with a profound, aching loneliness that felt dangerously familiar. I would feel a flicker of something, an anomaly in my own system, and I would ruthlessly stamp it out. That was not my concern. My concern was the angle of his hip flexion, the atrophy in his gastrocnemius. The lie we lived was a professional one. I was the expert, he was the client. It was a clean, sterile arrangement, a line drawn in the sand, clear and absolute. But the mountains didn't care about our lines, and the snow was already beginning to fall. The storm arrived without fanfare, a quiet thickening of the sky, a gradual erasure of the horizon. By the third day, it was no longer falling. It was a solid, vertical wall of white, a roaring, ceaseless descent that swallowed the world. The house, once a vantage point, became a ship in a sea of white, its glass walls showing us nothing but the swirling chaos outside. The power flickered once, twice, and then died with a quiet final sigh. The silence that followed was absolute. The hum of the climate control, the soft glow of the recessed lighting, the whisper of the air filtration, all gone. We were left with only the sound of the wind howling around the sharp edges of the house and the frantic, almost silent hiss of the snow piling up against the glass. "Well," Theodore said, his voice unnaturally loud in the sudden stillness, "that's not ideal." I saw him shiver, a subtle tremor that had nothing to do with his injury. The house was already losing its heat, the vast panes of glass leaching warmth into the storm. The backup generator was supposed to be automatic, but the silence remained unbroken. "The generator housing is outside the main structure," I said, my mind already cycling through protocols, contingency plans. The snow might have blocked the intake. "And you're going out in that?" The question held a note of something I couldn't immediately categorize. Not concern, exactly. Something else. It's necessary. My world was built on necessity. It took me 20 minutes to wrestle into the cold weather gear stored in the mudroom. When I stepped outside, the force of the wind was a physical blow, stealing my breath. The snow was already waist deep, a thick, heavy powder that fought me with every step. The world was a maelstrom of white and sound. By the time I reached the generator unit, a low metal box 50 feet from the house, I was covered in a thick crust of snow, my own body heat melting and refreezing it into a brittle armor. As I'd suspected, the air intake was completely buried under a massive drift. It took another hour of brutal, exhausting work with a shovel to clear it. My muscles screamed, my lungs burned with the frigid air. When I finally got the engine to turn over, its roar was a defiant shout against the storm's fury. The lights in the house flickered back on, a warm, golden promise in the blizzard. When I stumbled back inside, shedding layers of ice-caked gear, I found Theodore waiting. He hadn't moved from the main living area, and he was wrapped in a thick wool blanket, his face pale in the restored light. "You're soaked," he stated. It wasn't an observation. It was an accusation. "I'll manage." "Don't be an idiot, Elijah." The words were sharp, cutting through my professional detachment. "You'll get hypothermia. Go take a hot shower. That's an order." I froze. He had used my name, and he had given me an order. The dynamic, the carefully constructed hierarchy of our relationship had just been inverted. He was the client. I was the provider. But in that moment, with the storm raging outside and the cold clinging to me like a second skin, he was the one dictating terms. This was the first breach. A hairline crack in the wall. I showered, the hot water a painful shock against my numb skin. I dressed in my own sweats and a thermal shirt. When I came back out, he had a fire roaring in the massive pit-style fireplace that dominated the center of the room. He had also poured 2 glasses of amber liquid, whiskey. "For medicinal purposes," he said, holding one out to me. His hand was not entirely steady. I shouldn't have taken it. Alcohol was a depressant, a variable that could compromise my focus. But refusing felt like an act of aggression, a clumsy attempt to rebuild a wall that had already been compromised. I took the glass. The crystal was heavy, the liquor radiating a faint warmth that had nothing to do with its temperature. We sat in 2 low leather chairs, facing the fire, the storm a distant, muffled roar outside the glass. The generator provided power, but we left most of the lights off, letting the flames be our primary illumination. The firelight danced across the sharp planes of his face, throwing the hollows under his cheekbones into sharp relief. "I've never felt the house this small," he said, staring into the flames. "I designed it to feel boundless, to bring the outside in. Never occurred to me the outside might one day try to break down the door." There was a dry, ironic humor in his voice, the kind I recognized. The humor of a man acknowledging the absurdity of his own powerlessness. "It's a well-built structure," I said, the words feeling stiff, inadequate. He turned his head and looked at me. Really looked at me. It wasn't the appraising gaze of a client or the polite glance of an acquaintance. His blue eyes were clear and direct, and in their depths I saw a flicker of something that went beyond our sterile arrangement. He was seeing me, Elijah, the man who had just battled a blizzard to keep the lights on. Not the therapist, not the machine. I felt it like a physical touch, a pressure against my sternum. My own fortress, the one I'd spent a lifetime constructing, felt suddenly as fragile as his glass walls. I held his gaze for a beat too long, a moment stretched taut with a silent, terrifying communication. I saw the exhaustion in him, the pain he kept so carefully leashed. But I also saw a flicker of gratitude, of connection. "He sees you." The thought was an intrusion, a foreign signal in my carefully controlled internal monologue. He sees the man behind the wall. I broke the contact first, looking back into the fire, my heart hammering against my ribs. A physiological response to a perceived threat. That's all it was. My hand tightened around my glass, the cool crystal a grounding sensation. The storm raged for 2 more days. The generator kept the lights and heat on, but the satellite connection for the internet and phones was dead. We were truly cut off, adrift in our glass and steel arc. The rigid schedule I had created dissolved, replaced by a new rhythm dictated by necessity and the shared space. We moved around each other in the vast, open-plan house, our paths crossing in a silent, constrained orbit. The professional distance I had so carefully maintained began to collapse under the sheer, relentless weight of proximity. It started with the small things. The shared task of cooking, a clumsy dance in his hyper-modern kitchen. My movements were efficient, economical. His were hesitant, hampered by his leg, but he insisted on helping. Our hands would brush as we reached for the same utensil, a fleeting contact of skin on skin that sent a jolt of pure static through my system. I would retreat, reclassifying the event. Accidental, meaningless. But my skin would burn where he had touched it for minutes afterward. The sensory data became overwhelming. I was acutely aware of him in a way that defied my training. I learned the sound of his breathing, the shallow, sharp intakes of breath when a spasm of pain shot through his back, the deeper, slower rhythm when he slept. I learned his scent, a mixture of that clean, woody cologne, the faint, crisp smell of his laundry, and something else, something uniquely his, a warm, human scent that clung to the air in whatever room he had just left. I could track his presence in the house by scent alone. The house was always cold now, despite the generator. The fire was our center of gravity, the place we were both inexorably pulled. We'd sit for hours in the evenings, the silence between us no longer empty, but filled with a dense, unspoken tension. He would stretch out his bad leg toward the flames, his face a mask of weary endurance. And my professional gaze, the one that saw only angles and muscle groups, began to fail. I started to see the man. I saw the vulnerability in the line of his throat, the exhaustion etched around his eyes. One evening, he dropped his book. It landed just out of his reach. He made a move to bend down, and I saw his entire body seize, a sharp hiss of pain escaping his lips. Before I could think, before I could process it through my protocols, I was moving. I knelt, picked up the book, and placed it back in his hand. My fingers brushed his, and this time the contact lingered for a fraction of a second too long. His skin was cool, his grip surprisingly strong. "Thanks," he murmured, his voice rough. I just nodded, retreating to my chair, my heart rate elevated. The analysis came a second later, a frantic attempt to regain control. Action. Assistance. Justification. Preventing further injury to the client. Contact. Incidental. But the logic felt thin, a flimsy shield against the raw, unprocessed reality of the moment. The feeling of his skin against mine, the look in his eyes, a mixture of pain and something else. Gratitude. Dependence. It was a dangerous combination. The crack in the wall was widening. The nights were the worst. The wind howled its mournful song, a constant reminder of our isolation. My room was on the opposite side of the central living space from his, but the house's open design meant sound traveled. On the third night of the storm, I was awoken by a sound that was not the wind. It was a low, guttural noise, choked off as soon as it began. I was out of bed instantly, my senses on high alert. I moved silently through the darkened house, my feet making no sound on the cold, polished concrete floors. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting long, distorted shadows. I followed the sound to his bedroom door, which was slightly ajar. Another sound. A pained gasp. Protocol dictated I announce my presence. Protocol dictated I respect his privacy. I ignored protocol. I pushed the door open. He was on the floor, tangled in his sheets, his body arched in a rictus of agony. One hand was clenched against his lower back, the other gripping the leg of the bed, his knuckles white. His face, illuminated by the faint glow of the embers from the main room, was slick with sweat, his teeth clenched so hard I could hear them grinding. He was trying to be silent, trying to ride out the wave of pain alone in the dark, but his body was betraying him. This was the moment the facade shattered completely. Not just the crack in the wall, but a total structural failure. The invincible architect, the charismatic visionary, the disciplined client, all gone. In their place was just a man, drowning in a sea of pain, alone in the dark. A different set of protocols took over. Ones forged not in a therapist's office, but in the field. The objective was no longer repair, but stabilization, preservation. I didn't speak. I didn't turn on the light. I crossed the room and knelt beside him. "Theodore," I said, my voice low and steady. "Breathe." His eyes flew open, wide and unfocused with pain. He didn't seem to recognize me for a second. He just saw a shape in the darkness. "Focus on me," I commanded, pitching my voice to cut through the static of his agony. "Match my breathing. In." I took a slow, deliberate breath. Out. He tried, but his breath hitched in a ragged sob. The muscle spasms were violent, rippling through his back and down his leg. I put a hand on his shoulder. My touch was meant to be grounding, a point of physical contact to anchor his awareness. But the moment my palm met the damp fabric of his t-shirt, something shifted. The heat of his skin was intense, a feverish, desperate warmth. The fine tremors of his agony traveled up my arm, a direct feed of his suffering into my own nervous system. He flinched at my touch, a cornered animal's response. "Don't," he rasped, his voice shredded. "Don't see this." The witnessed vulnerability. He was ashamed. The great Theodore Thorne, brought to his knees by his own broken body. His pride was a fortress of its own, and it was crumbling. "I'm not looking," I lied. "I'm here. Just breathe with me." I shifted my position, moving behind him. "Lean back," I said. He hesitated, his body rigid with tension and mistrust. "Theodore, let me help." Slowly, hesitantly, he let his weight settle back against my chest. The contact was electric. His body was a furnace, radiating heat and pain. I wrapped one arm around his torso, my other hand going to the knotted, seizing muscles of his lower back. I began to apply firm, steady pressure, using the heel of my palm to work into the epicenter of the spasm. He gasped, his whole body going rigid. "Easy," I murmured, my mouth close to his ear. "Stay with me. Breathe." And so we stayed there, on the cold floor in the dark, for what felt like an eternity. Me, a human brace, murmuring commands to breathe, pouring my own steadiness into him. Him, a man stripped of all his defenses, his body trembling in my arms. I could feel his heart hammering against my own ribs, a frantic, syncopated rhythm. I could feel every shuddering breath he took. The professional line wasn't just blurred, it had been vaporized. I was no longer his therapist. I was his anchor. I was the wall holding back the flood. Slowly, painstakingly, the storm in his body began to subside. The violent spasms eased into deep, aching tremors. His breathing deepened, losing its ragged edge. He sagged against me, his head falling back against my shoulder, his entire weight a dead, trusting burden. The fight had gone out of him. He didn't speak for a long time. The only sounds were the wind outside and our synchronized breathing, which had finally fallen into the same rhythm. "It's never been that bad before," he finally whispered, his voice barely audible. "You're safe," I said. The words came out without my permission, a raw, instinctive response. He turned his head slightly, his cheek brushing against my collarbone. The contact was feather light, but it landed on my skin like a brand. I could feel the dampness of his hair, smell the salt of his sweat, the clean scent of his soap, now mingled with the raw, animal scent of pain. I had spent my entire adult life cultivating distance, building armor. My strength was my detachment. But in that dark room, Holding the broken pieces of this man together with my bare hands, I felt a terrifying, exhilarating shift. My role had reversed. I was no longer the detached observer. I was the protector. And the thought of letting him go, of re-establishing that distance, felt like a physical impossibility. It felt like letting him drown. The storm outside broke the next morning. The wind died down, and the world was left in a state of profound, muffled stillness, buried under 4 feet of pristine snow. The sun came out, dazzlingly bright, turning the landscape into a sea of diamonds. The power was stable. The spell was broken. Or so it should have been. But the storm inside the house lingered. The atmosphere was charged, heavy with the memory of the night before. The vast, open space that had once felt minimalist and clean now felt claustrophobic. Every glance loaded with unspoken meaning, every silence thick with tension. We moved around each other like 2 celestial bodies whose orbits had been irrevocably altered. The old gravitational rules no longer applied. I tried to reinstate the routine. I tried to put the armor back on. 0800, I said, my voice sounding hollow in the sunlit kitchen. Time for your mobility work. Theodore was standing by the massive window, staring out at the snow. He was leaning on his cane again, a prop he hadn't needed while leaning on me. He turned slowly, and his eyes met mine. There was no trace of the charming client or the broken man from the floor. This was someone new, someone who had seen behind my wall, just as I had seen behind his. No, he said quietly. The refusal was a quiet detonation in the room. He had never once questioned my authority, never deviated from the plan. It's crucial for your recovery, I stated, falling back on the familiar language of my profession. We can't lose the progress we've made. What progress, Elijah? He took a step toward me, his limp more pronounced than I had seen it in days. You can fix the machine. You're good at that. But what about the man inside it? Is that part of your regimen? I had no answer. He was talking about the ghost variable. The one thing my system had no protocol for. My job is to rehabilitate your injury, I said, the words a weak defense. My injury isn't just in my leg, he shot back, his voice raw. It's the fact that I built this place, this monument to control, and I'm a prisoner in it. It's the fact that my partners are calling, wondering if I'll ever be able to walk onto a construction site again. It's the fact that I lie awake at night, terrified that the pain will never, ever go away. He gestured around the beautiful, empty room. And I've been doing it all alone. He took another step, closing the distance between us. He was close enough now that I could feel the heat coming off his body, see the faint tremor in his hand as he gripped his cane. Until last night, he said, his voice dropping. Last night, I wasn't alone. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. This is dangerous territory. Retreat. Re-establish boundaries. My training screamed at me, but my body refused to obey. I was rooted to the spot, held in place by the magnetic pull of his gaze. He was showing me his weakness, his fear, not as a symptom to be diagnosed, but as a truth to be shared. It was an offering, a test. I thought about the man on the floor, his pride stripped away, his body betraying him. I thought about the feeling of his weight against me, the trust in that surrender. My role as his protector hadn't ended when the sun came up. I realized, with a terrifying clarity, that it had just begun. The physical work was just a shell, a pretext. The real work was this, standing here, not flinching. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. You're not alone now, I said. The words were quiet, but they felt like the heaviest thing I had ever lifted. A flicker of something. Relief? surprise, passed through his eyes. He searched my face, looking for the professional, for the therapist. He didn't find him. The day passed in a strange haze. We abandoned the schedule. We talked. Not about his leg, not about his range of motion. He talked about his work, the passion that drove him to create these impossible buildings, the weight of the expectations on his shoulders. I found myself talking too, sharing sterile, clipped anecdotes from my past that, in the quiet intimacy of that house, felt like profound confessions. I told him about the discipline of the military, the cold logic of repair, without ever mentioning the loneliness that underpinned it all. He heard it anyway. I could see it in his eyes. He heard the negative space, the things I wasn't saying. The satellite service flickered back to life in the late afternoon. His phone, sitting on the marble countertop, buzzed to life, a sudden, violent intrusion of the outside world. It buzzed again, and again, a relentless barrage of notifications. Theodore stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. The tension snapped back into his shoulders. The mask of the architect, the man with responsibilities, began to slide back into place. He started, his voice strained. They'll be worried. Theodore. I said his name, and he stopped, his hand hovering over the phone. They can wait, I said. It was a command, but it was also a plea. Stay here, in this quiet space we've found. Just a little longer. He looked from the phone to me, his expression torn. The outside world, with all its demands and pressures, was calling. The safe harbor we had created in the storm was about to be breached. He slowly pulled his hand back. He didn't touch the phone. That evening, the tension was different. It was no longer a wire stretched between two strangers. It was a heavy, charged current, flowing between two people who had seen too much of each other to go back. We ate dinner in near silence, the clinking of our forks against the plates echoing in the cavernous room. Every accidental brush of our knees under the table was a shock. Every shared glance was a conversation. After dinner, we stood by the fireplace, the dying embers casting a warm, red glow. The world outside the glass was a deep, star-filled indigo. It was beautiful, peaceful. But inside, a final storm was gathering. The professional lie was dead and buried. The roles of protector and protected had been established. But we were standing on a new precipice, and the silence was begging to be filled. The roads will be cleared by morning, he said, his voice low. You'll be able to leave. There it was. The challenge. The door being opened for me to walk through. To return to the safety of my rules and my fortress. I could nod, agree, and in the morning we could pretend the last few days were an anomaly, a strange fever dream brought on by the storm. I could go back to being the engineer. He could go back to being the machine. My entire life, my entire being, was geared toward choosing the safe path, the logical path. And every instinct for self-preservation screamed at me to take the out he was offering. But when I looked at him, standing there in the firelight, looking so fragile and so strong at the same time, the thought of leaving felt like a physical amputation. It felt like walking away from the only real thing I had touched in a decade. I took a step closer to him. The space between us shrank, becoming dense, pressurized. I could feel the heat from his body, smell the scent of wood smoke clinging to his sweater. His breath hitched, a tiny, almost inaudible sound. He knew. He felt the shift, the final, irreversible change in the forces between us. He looked down at the small space separating our bodies on the floor, as if it were a literal line etched into the concrete. He smiled, a sad, knowing, terrified smile. "This is it, Elijah," he whispered, his voice rough with an emotion I couldn't name. "This is where the line is drawn." He was giving me one last chance to retreat. He was trying to protect me. Or maybe he was trying to protect himself. He was showing me the boundary, the edge of the cliff. He was telling me that if I crossed it, there was no going back. We would fall, and we would fall together. My heart was a frantic, wild thing in my chest, a caged bird beating against my ribs. The silence stretched, taut and humming. All my rules, all my codes, all the walls I had built, brick by painful brick, were screaming at me to stop, to turn back. But the yearning, the deep, foundational ache for this connection, was louder. It was a force of nature, like the storm, like gravity. I looked from the floor back to his eyes. They were wide, vulnerable, waiting. I saw my own fear reflected there, and my own desperate hope. I had to make the choice. The conscious choice to abandon the armor and step into the fire. I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper, a thread of sound in the charged air. What if I erase it? Right now. The question hung between us, a promise and a threat. It was the verbal plea, the final confession of need, stripped of all artifice. It was the key to my own fortress, and I was handing it to him. Theodore's breath shuddered out of him in a long, shaky sigh. The last of his resistance seemed to crumble, the tension draining from his shoulders. He didn't answer with words. He didn't need to. He closed his eyes, a silent, absolute surrender. That was all the permission I needed. I closed the final inches between us. The lie was gone. The pretense of professionalism had been scoured away by the storm and the confession of the night before, leaving only the raw, undeniable truth. I needed this. I needed him. My hand came up, not as a therapist's, not to assess or correct, but to connect. My fingers hesitated for a fraction of a second before cupping the side of his neck, my thumb stroking the rough stubble along his jaw. His skin was hot, electric. He leaned into my touch, a small, desperate movement that spoke volumes. This was the surrender. Not just his, but mine. It was the conscious dismantling of a lifetime of self-imposed isolation. It was terrifying. It was relief. His hands came up to grip the front of my shirt, his knuckles pressing into my chest. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was the desperate act of a drowning man finding a life raft. He was holding on, anchoring himself to me. I was his protector, but he was my salvation. I lowered my head, and he met me halfway. The embrace was not gentle. It was a collision, a collapse. I wrapped my arms around him, pulling him flush against me, my face burying in the crook of his neck. He shuddered, a full body tremor, and his arms tightened around my back, holding me with a strength that belied his injuries. We just stood there, locked together in front of the dying fire, holding each other up. It was a moment of profound, desperate intimacy that transcended anything I had ever known. I could feel the frantic, unsteady beat of his heart against my own. I breathed in his scent, cedar and wood smoke, and the warm, undeniable smell of him, and it felt like coming home. The fortress was gone. The walls had collapsed, and in the ruins there was this raw, terrifying, beautiful connection. There was no analysis, no justification. For the first time in my adult life, my mind was blessedly, completely quiet. There was only the feeling of his body pressed against mine, the solid, grounding weight of him, the sound of our breathing slowly, finally, falling into the same steady rhythm. The storm was over. We had survived. We didn't speak. Words were inadequate, clumsy tools for what was passing between us. After a long time, I loosened my grip slightly, and he eased back, though our bodies remained connected at the hip and shoulder. His hands stayed fisted in my shirt. My hand was still on his neck, my thumb stroking his skin in a slow, steady rhythm. His eyes, when they met mine, were clear and unguarded. The fear was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet vulnerability that I knew was a mirror of my own. He had seen the truth of me, and he hadn't run. I had seen the truth of him, and I had stayed. Slowly, deliberately, I used my free hand to pry the carbon fiber cane from his grasp. It clattered softly onto the polished concrete floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. He watched it fall, then looked back at me, a question in his eyes. I answered by shifting my weight, taking more of his, letting him lean on me completely. He let out a shaky breath and sagged against me, a silent admission of trust. We stood like that for another eternity. Two men propping each other up in the ruins of their own defenses. The silence was no longer tense or heavy with unspoken things. It was a new kind of silence, comfortable, grounding, a shared stillness that was more intimate than any conversation. The fire had burned down to a soft, pulsing bed of crimson embers, and the first pale hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the eastern sky. The night was over. A new day was coming. The outside world, with its demands and its rules, would return. The roads would be cleared. The phones would ring. People would expect us to resume our old shapes, to step back into the roles we were supposed to play. But something fundamental had been broken and remade between us. We couldn't go back. The line had been erased. He eventually stirred, a slight shift of his weight. "Elijah," he whispered, his voice thick. "I'm here," I answered. It was all I needed to say. It was a promise. There were no grand declarations, no plans for the future. There was only the unspoken pact, a shared look that said, "We figure this out, together." Whatever came next, we would face it from this new place of raw, terrifying honesty. I kept one arm around him, supporting him, as we moved away from the cold hearth. We walked slowly, in step, toward the wall of glass that was now beginning to reflect the soft pinks and oranges of the sunrise. We stood there, side by side, watching the world outside come back to life, bathed in the gentle light of a new morning. My old life was a fortress, built on the principle that control was strength and vulnerability was a fatal flaw. I had been wrong. True strength wasn't in the height of your walls or the thickness of your armor. It was in finding the one person who made you feel safe enough to lower the drawbridge. It was having the courage to let them see the man inside the machine. Vulnerability wasn't the weakness I had feared. It was the ultimate act of trust. A quiet, desperate surrender that was, in the end, the only thing that could truly set you free.